Well, I want to thank you all for being here, and Tony's right. I know that education isn't the most popular subject, and you know, sometimes when I'm out socializing and somebody asks me what I do, instead of telling them that I'm a policy expert, I tell them I'm a waitress, just so I can avoid the subject. So I understand, and I appreciate you still being here. And education, it does drive so much of what we do when it comes to our classrooms and curriculum and pedagogy. And so there's nothing more political than education. Nothing more political than education. And yet when it comes to education, it's the trend is to not be political for educators. So we find ourselves in a quandary. And whenever I'm talking to educators about policy, I like to use a different definition than one that you've heard before. And the definition of policy is spirituality applied. Our spirituality applied. I'm going to just jump right in, because when it comes to policy, there isn't any kind of easy way to transition into it. And I'm going to start with Goals 2000 and the Clinton administration.
Our Goals 2000 proposal will empower individual school districts to experiment with ideas like chartering their schools to be run by private corporations or having more public school choice, to do whatever they wish to do as long as we measure every school by one high
standard. I hope you heard the word privatization, because there's a lot of talk about privatizing public education, and it's not a secret. It's not something that people have tried to keep under wraps. It's actually been pretty openly discussed. The thing that I wanted you to pick up from Goals 2000, because what happened during Goals 2000 is that all states were required to develop their own set of standards. But the part in his speech where he talks about we're going to measure every school by one standard, that's the part where we really need to take issue with. Because it's the same thing as saying we're going to measure everything with a ruler. We're going to measure climate with a ruler. We're going to measure the stock market with a ruler. Got a medical condition? We got a ruler. It's absurd that we would use one single measurement tool in the evaluation and assessment of our schools and our children. So the one thing that you might hear a lot about that really kind of drives this teaching or this testing craze, this testing obsession, is that we're ranking in the middle when it comes to math and sciences and all these foreign, these international test studies. And Tom Lovelace from the Brookings Institute, scholar, conducted a very fascinating study. And what he found was that the very first international test was conducted in 1965. And during that test, there were 12 countries surveyed. And of those 12 countries that were surveyed, the United States came in 11th, at the bottom. And yet, 5 years later, the United States was the first to put a man on the moon. We have the largest economy. We have the most original patents. And elite families from all of the world continue to send their children to be educated in America's colleges and universities. So if those tests are saying that America is at the bottom, then they must be measuring the wrong things. The other thing that I think that we forget is that if all of our emphasis is on measuring, and yet that's only one component of teaching and learning, we're missing the bigger picture. And I like to use the analogy, the stars in the sky. And for every star that you can see, there are a million stars that you can't see. And that's how it is with children. What we got as a result of Goals 2000 is standards, and this might look familiar to you because this is the Wisconsin State Standards. And once you make your commitment that you're going to measure everything by one standard, you have to decide what that standard is. And so in the late 1990s, what happened is they embarked on writing the state standards. It wasn't a new concept. I mean, we've been having curriculum guides and the standards essentially since the one-room schoolhouse. But this was every state developing their own standard. And I don't know how many revisions that you've gone through in Wisconsin, but it's very common that every time there's a new department head that's elected or a new commissioner that comes in, that they rewrite the standards. And it's great business for publishing companies because every time you rewrite the standards, all those school districts, they have to replace all of their curriculum. So standards is a big business industry. And the challenge with standards, there isn't anything wrong with standards. You know, I'm not against standards. I'm not for them either. They're words on a page, and we forget that. But the problem with standards is that the emphasis is on content. And the solution is it's all about what to teach. Then if we teach the kids the right thing, we'll have prepared them. It's what to teach. And what we want to focus on as teachers is getting kids how to think. Not the what, but the how that's important. Next, after we have standards, after we've got the what to measure, the decision is how are we going to ensure that teachers are teaching the standards and students are learning those standards.
And as a result, the bill came to the Senate floor, passed overwhelmingly, and I had the honor of signing it this morning. I wish you could have seen the piece of legislation. It's really tall. And I admit I hadn't read it yet. And you'll be happy to hear I don't intend to.
So he didn't read it, and he didn't intend to read it. And it impacted the lives of millions of children. And Congress didn't read it either. Because if Congress had read it, they would have learned that demanding equality in expectations without providing equality in opportunities makes no sense. Makes no sense. And the answer here is really at the core of the problem. And what happened when No Child Left Behind was signed into law is that we transferred the authority away from locally elected school districts, superintendents, parents, and teachers, and we put it in the hands of test publishers. And we said that when it comes to monitoring the quality of our schools, we're not going to take responsibility for that. We're going to pass that off to some shaded bubble Scantron sheet to do the work for us. And that's the problem. The idea that standards and tests are going to improve learning and academic experience for our children is wrong. And I want to use an analogy, a little story about this preschool teacher. Her name was Christina de Verona. And she had a back-to-school night, and she brought all the parents together, and she broke them up into two groups. And she took one of the groups of parents, and she directed them at a table, and she said to them, now, I've cut out the eyes and the nose and the mouth for you, and I want you to glue this onto the pumpkin. And then she took the second group of parents, and she went to a different table where there were markers and glitter and paints and beads and feathers and all different colors of paper and streamers. And she said to them, I want you to create something. And then she got out a piece of paper and a pencil, and she walked around to both of those groups. And when she came to the first group, what she noticed was that there was very little conversation, that those parents weren't engaged, that they weren't attending to the learning, that they weren't connecting. When she walked over to the second group, what she found were parents collaborating and working together, talking about their experiences, talking about what they learned, making connections, sharing idea after idea. And at the end of that exercise, she took all of the pumpkins and she stood them at the front of the room. And the first group, all of their pumpkins, there they were, identical to each other. And the second group of pumpkins, everyone was different. In fact, some didn't even look like pumpkins. There were abstract pumpkins, all different kinds. And she says to the parents, what I want you to know is that your child is an individual and will be treated individually. No two kids are the same. And in my classroom, I will teach to the interests and the abilities of your child, and they will develop all in very different ways. And she said to the first group, I will never treat your children like they are standardized on a factory line. So those parents learned more in that one exercise than policy leaders have learned over the last 2 years. This goal to standardize and mechanize and industrialize children, it won't work. And if it did work, it would be a disaster to this country, where the strength of what we have is because of freedom of thought and ideas, an attention to diversity and a respect for diversity, and developing every human being. We don't want a whole generation of color bubble colorers. That shouldn't be the goal. That doesn't serve us, and it doesn't serve our children. So the other thing is that, you know, with this whole high stakes and failing schools and failing teachers, what it did was it took those students who have a similar experience of a table with few resources, and it punished and condemned them. Took their schools, and what we saw like in New York and Texas, turned them over to private corporations, where the research shows they did no better with those kids, and in most cases, worse, much worse. And this isn't different from the eugenics movement. How many are familiar with the eugenics movement? 1920s, we had the eugenics movement. What they did, they came in with the IQ test. They used it to sort and track kids. It was a way to legitimize racism, and it kept those in power, and those that weren't in power kept them ignorant and dependent. So this whole emphasis around tracking and sorting and testing, it's not a new concept. We've been here. We've done it before. Here's an example, and whenever I'm lecturing in a state, I always try to pull examples from your school or from your state, and they're not hard. They release sample test items. So here's this one: it's a nonfiction item. Why is it so hard to get ketchup out of the bottle? So everybody says, well, what's so wrong with test scores? And I'll tell you, because I just cleaned out my office. I have the scars and some bruises to prove it. And I had 5 boxes of files, 10 years of research. And I could not find one research study that demonstrated that high-stakes testing was a good means for improving teaching or learning. Not one.